This episode of Weekly Spooky is brought to you by Boggy Creek, the series, free to watch on Tubi. Follow the exploits of Roger and Sarah, two researchers of the American Yeti Project, as they investigate Bigfoot and try to find proof positive of the legendary monster. But what other mysteries will they uncover in the mysterious backwoods of Boggy Creek? Starring Eric Roberts of The Dark Knight, Brink Stevens of Slumber Party Massacre, Mike Holinsky of Haunted House on Sorority Row, and Joni Durian of Babysitter Massacre. Bigfoot just might be the least of their worries as they encounter cursed scarecrows, serial killers, witches, dangerous bank robbers, and ruthless poachers, among many others. So check it out today, free to stream on Tubi. Boggy Creek, the series. Executive produced by Fred Olin Ray, and directed by Henrik Kuto. Hey, that's me.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my friends. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means, don't you? It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Henrik Kuto, and we have a very dark and creepy story for you this week. And we'll get to it in just a moment. But first, please take just a moment to make sure you are subscribed on your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a star rating. It really helps the show, and it costs you nothing. Leave us a star rating whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify, or anywhere in between, and you'll help new listeners find their way to the spooky. I really do appreciate it. And if you want to help us directly, go to WeeklySpooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the show and get exclusive content. Every month now, we'll be offering a bonus episode of Weekly Spooky just for our Patreon backers, and we hope you'll join them. We're at 80 backers right now. I'd love to see us reach 100 this year. And thank you to all who have joined and all who have supported us. But for now, my friends, it's getting dark, it's getting late, and it's time for the scare. When you were a child, did you like to play games? Did you like to play games by yourself or with friends, family, siblings? Well, in tonight's story, we go a little deeper into what happens when a game isn't a game anymore. What happens when you're playing for keeps, when there are no rules, when the only way to lose is death? Enjoy the story, my friends. Why Am I Here? By Morgan Moore. Bruce Evans sits on his knees in his bedroom. In front of him is an old coffee table with a Ouija board on top of it. Around the mystical board were candles burning away. Bruce closes his eyes and takes in a deep breath and exhales slowly. O spirits, if anyone or anything is present, please answer my question. Bruce opens his eyes and looks at the board. The question he had wanted to ask was lodged in his throat, unwilling to come out. It was something he wanted to ask many people, but was afraid to. He was always told to not question certain things, and it was fear of repercussions that left him unable to ask those he trusted most the question. But with this board, the spirits could answer him. It would not judge. It would not punish. The board would give him his answer, and clarity. Spirits, tell me, why am I here? He asked somberly. The boy was the youngest of the Evans family. He had one sibling, an older brother in his teens named Mark. Bruce had been something his brother wanted, and his parents, after a while, were able to give him that. But it had been clear since Bruce could remember that he only existed to be a plaything for his brother. Once Mark got older and started spending more time out with friends and with girls, he had no more use for his younger brother, his personal toy. Not being the most social of children either meant Bruce had a hard time making friends. It left him depressed, lonely, and made him question the reason he even existed. Did he have a purpose other than to be a plaything for somebody only to be discarded like any other toy? He stared at the Ouija board with one hand placed on the planchette. Bruce had heard about Ouija boards and how they could communicate with another plane of existence. From what he gathered, people mostly used them to ask questions and get answers. He thought that maybe, just maybe, it could answer his question and tell him what his raison d'etre was. The only problem with getting one was just that, getting one. His family were heavily steeped in religion, as was the majority of people in the area. Bruce himself attended a Catholic school. Mr. and Mrs. Evans would never approve of him buying something so supernatural and evil. Mark wouldn't be able to help either, since he was always busy with his social life. If Bruce wanted to get a hold of a Ouija board, he'd have to do it himself. So, for a month, Bruce saved his allowance until he could afford to buy one via a mail-away ad he found in the back of a monster magazine. The weeks leading up to its arrival were ones of suspense and fear. Bruce was afraid that his brother, or worse, his parents, would see it in the mail and punish him for it, and for his temptation to interact with the dark side. He watched for the mailman like a hawk on Saturdays and would run home from school to be sure he was the one to check the mail. After a month, it finally arrived. Bruce was ecstatic and sprinted up to his room with the package. Now it was nearly dinner, and here he was, waiting for his answer. The planchette did not move, though. Am I doing something wrong? Bruce asked himself. He had done everything he'd heard about. Candles, the prayer at the beginning, how he addressed the board and the spirit. He did everything he thought was necessary to make it work. Yet here Bruce was in his room staring at the board. Why? Why isn't it working? He asked aloud. Isn't it obvious? A voice came suddenly. Bruce gasped in shock and turned around quickly. It was Mark. He sighed in relief. Mark? Bruce started. Those things are just toys. A child's plaything. You really think stores and all these major companies are actually selling something that would let you talk to ghosts and goblins? Man, you are so stupid, Mark said snarkily. But, the younger Evans stammered out. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could Mark say that? Ouija boards had been a thing for centuries. People swore by them. Or maybe Mark was telling the truth. Finish up your little game and then come down for dinner, Mark told his younger brother before starting to close the door. He didn't get far in his action. Wait, if this isn't real, then how would I get an actual one? I mean, these things have been around forever. Bruce questioned his brother, almost pleading in his tone. Mark stopped with the door half shut. Why do you want to know? You know Mom and Dad will kill you if they find out about it. I have something I want to ask, but I can't ask anybody else. It's private, Bruce explained as best he could without divulging what his question was. His brother scoffed some before answering. Well, If you're the expert on Ouija, you should know already. You have to kill your whole family and use their blood and bodies to make the board and that pointer thing. Only then can you truly communicate with the divine spirits. Or it's all a bunch of hocus-pocus bullshit. Come on, it's time to eat. Faster we're done with dinner, the faster I can go out with my date. And with that, Mark left Bruce alone. He couldn't believe it. All his hard work to save money, all the time spent waiting for the Ouija board to come was for nothing. A toy. A board game. That's all it apparently was. Bruce felt depressed at the knowledge his brother imparted on him. I'll never get an answer to my question. The only way I would is if No, I'd never do that, Bruce quietly said to himself. The boy sighed and stood up. Depression flowed through him at the revelation. Bruce couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it, but he seemed to have no other choice. He turned to leave his bedroom when he felt a chill. Bruce turned around to find the candles were no longer lit. I didn't blow them out, he told himself. He looked to the window, but found it shut, and thus ruled out that a gust of wind had gotten through and blown them out. Yet, he had felt a chill. Bruce heard his name being called, and shrugged off the occurrence, closing the door behind him. The grandfather clock in Evan's living room sounded off. It was 2 a.m. Mark opened the front door as quietly as possible to not alert his parents to his late homecoming. He slid off his shoes and crept into the house, making sure that he closed the door as quietly as he opened it. Mark stood still while he listened to the house and tried to pick up on any sign of his parents. Nothing. Quiet as a church the day after Christmas. He sighed in relief and started to make his way to the kitchen. As he walked towards the entrance, he saw that the light was on. Weird. Somebody must have forgot to turn it off. He entered the kitchen and stopped, dead in his tracks, mouth twisting open in horror. The kitchen floor, normally a pearlescent white, was splattered with blood and viscera. Mark's eyes darted around the kitchen to find the source of the mess. Eventually, his eyes and feet took him to the source. On the other side of the island was the Evans dog, Scruffy. The dog was torn completely open, with its organs piled in front of it, its blood everywhere. Mark doubled over and vomited onto the floor, adding to the mess. He continued heaving as his mind tried to make sense of what he just saw. Who would do such a thing to a poor dog? He asked himself. Then another thought came. Mom! Dad! The eldest of the Evan boys found his strength returning at the thought of his parents being in danger. He jumped to his feet and made a mad dash to the stairs and quickly found himself on the second floor. Mark looked over at Bruce's door and found it closed. He shook his head and carried on down the hallway toward his parents' room. The door was wide open, with faint light illuminating it. Mark burst in like a speeding bullet and found a scene much worse. Splayed out on the bed were his and Bruce's mother and father. Much like Scruffy, their blood and organs were all over the room. The mattress soaked so much it was beginning to sink into itself. Mark held a hand over his mouth as he went to investigate. He didn't make it far before throwing up again. The sight of their bodies having chunks of bone broken off, triggering his gag reflex. Unable to take more of the sight, Mark vacated the room. Mom! Dad! He choked out. His vision turned down the hall to Bruce's room. Mark found himself almost gliding down to the door, only vaguely aware of what was going on at this point. He reached out and turned the knob, watching as the door creaked open. In the middle of the room sat Bruce, surrounded by lit candles. Before him was a large chunk of bone. Painted on it were the letters of the alphabet and various numbers, all of them painted in blood. Bruce was covered in blood, head to toe, a bread knife sitting beside him. "Bruce?" Mark started, in fear. Bruce looked up at his brother and smiled a little. "Hi, Mark. What have you done?" Mark asked his brother. "I did what you said to do. I killed them all, and I've made the board out of their blood and bodies. I have a question that needs to be answered. This is the only way," Bruce explained. "I would have answered it for you," Mark said. "No, you wouldn't have. You would have made fun of me, belittled me, just like everybody else would. Besides, you wouldn't care anyways. I'm just a toy to you," Bruce told his older brother. Mark stared at his now ghoulish and psychotic little brother. He had no way to answer him. Mark could only start to slowly move towards Bruce. What Bruce said wasn't untrue, to some extent. Mark had to admit that he did make fun of and bully him. But Bruce being a toy to him was totally not true. It couldn't be, he told himself. He remembered asking his parents for a little brother to play with constantly. A lot of people did that, though. Was it really that selfish to ask for a sibling? Yet there was the fact that he would shrug off Bruce to do stuff with his friends, or on his own. It was something Mark did ever more so as the years went on. Maybe he had used his little brother as a plaything, and Bruce just never got to feel loved and wanted. "Bruce?" Mark started. "It's not done yet," his little brother said suddenly. Mark stopped in his tracks. "What do you mean?" "I still need the planchette," he responded. "What?" Mark asked. "I believe you called it the pointer thingy earlier. I still need it," Bruce explained. Cautiously, Mark walked up to Bruce and knelt down. He placed a hand on one of Bruce's shoulders and gave him a small smile. His little brother returned the smile. The head of a hammer cracked against the side of Mark's head a second later. Mark fell to the floor and started spasming as he looked at his brother. In Bruce's hand was the hammer. He moved on his knees over to Mark and smiled down at him. "Now then, let's play, big brother." Bruce raised the hammer and quickly brought it down against Mark's head. Again and again and again and again. The repeated blows broke into Mark's skull more and more. Bones chipped and then broke while blood and brain matter flew into the air. Bruce carried on, hammering his brother until he felt the hammer's head smashing against the floor. The now lone Evans tossed his weapon aside and picked up a piece of Mark's broken skull. He smiled and went back to the gruesomely made Ouija board. Bruce set the makeshift planchette on top of it, keeping his hand placed on it as well. Trembling, he fights back, smiling in excitement, and closes his eyes. "Oh, spirits, if you're here, come to me," he cries out. The flames that danced on the tips of the candles shot up wildly. Bruce's hand lost its grip on the planchette, and he watched as it started to move around the board at a frantic pace. His eyes darted with the piece of skull, only slowing down when it did. The planchette came to a crawl as it began to spell something out. M-O-L-O-C-H. Moloch, Bruce spelled, and then said. A gust of wind went through the room and blew out the candles. Afterwards, the board began to glow red, first lightly, and then blindingly. A moment later, the light was gone. In its place was a person. A snap of his fingers lighting the candles once more. Bruce stared at the stranger who now stood in his room. They had black hair that reached down to their shoulders, curled all along the way. The clothing they wore reminded Bruce of the costumes people would wear in plays based on Shakespeare. They were colored in a swirl of black and navy and red. Most striking of all was the face of the stranger. Their features were well defined and gave off the appearance of a man. While the candles made it hard to fully tell, their skin looked ashen. Yet what drew the most of Bruce's attention were the eyes. They were colored dark amber, but somehow shimmered. Who are you?" the boy asked. "I am Moloch. You called for my presence." The entity, now identifying themselves as Moloch, answered. "It worked then! I did it!" Bruce exclaimed in glee. Moloch smirked slightly at the excitement of the child. "What do you desire my services for?" they asked. Bruce looked up at Moloch. "I have a question I need answered," he said solemnly. "What is it?" Why am I here?" Bruce asked, timidly. Moloch looked down at the boy. They placed a hand on Bruce's head and closed their eyes. The pair stood there, in quiet, Bruce looking at the entity while Moloch concentrated. Soon Moloch opened his eyes and stared into the boy's. "I have seen your mind, your soul, your entire being. I can answer your question with the utmost clarity," they explained. "And?" Bruce questioned. "You are here. You exist to work for me. I have seen your work, and I quite enjoy it." "Really?" Bruce said, surprised and delighted that somebody liked something he did. Moloch knelt down and put their hand on Bruce's shoulder. "You and I were meant to work together, my child, and you and I are going to do such wonderfully lurid things together," Moloch explained. Bruce smiled widely in joy and wrapped his arms around Moloch in a hug. The entity returned the embrace, their face twisting into a devilishly macabre smile, and their eyes glowing intensely. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. A nice piece of simple, terrifying, gruesome storytelling for all of you to enjoy. Speaking of things for you all to enjoy, earlier this week I released a very special episode of Behind the Spooky, a bonus episode that lets you learn a little bit more about me and this program that I started almost 3 years ago. And if you enjoy that, please consider joining our Patreon, because there's more where that came from, my friends, and it's the #1 way to support our program directly. It's very much appreciated. And speaking of very much appreciating things, I want to say a humongous thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters. These are folks who pay just a little bit extra every month to hear their names on the program. And they are Christopher Sullivan, Kathy Proke, Gino Lyons, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, Jeff and George Hilton, Craig Cohen, and Kevin Fry. Thank you all so much. And speaking of, I want to mention also, for those who are interested in the world of filmmaking and the other side of my career, soon Patreon will have an exclusive podcast called Working Filmmaker, hosted by me, where I answer questions and give insights into the film business. So if that's the kind of thing you're into, it's exclusively at our Patreon, which you can find by going to WeeklySpooky.com. And if monthly payments aren't your thing, we also have lots of great merchandise, so you can not only look good, but you can represent how much you love the spooky every week. Anyway, my friends, it's about time for me to get back to it. So until next week, please stay safe, stay scary, and be well. So, for our executive producer, Rob Fields, my producer, Dan Wilder, and my composer, Ray Mattis, hey Ray, get well soon, by the way, we will see you next week, and I will talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.